That's Dr. Onafuwa.
Doctor, I'm sorry. Let me add the
Don't get
doctor
it
to
twisted.
it.
I earned it.
But I'm really excited to chat. And we're going to be talking about a lot of different things, hopefully. But specifically, I wanted to, chat about like this whole concept of decolonizing design, of transitional design, pluriverse, and what that means in the center of like inclusion and potentially thinking beyond inclusion, which I think we've talked about before, and in our past roles. And I think it's such an important topic and timely topic right now. So I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I'm excited to talk about these topics because they're important to me. So when I like to introduce myself, I not so much in terms of what I do for day-to-day work, but in terms of the intersections where I like to play. And I like to work as a professional, as a design research professional. I am also as a designer and as as someone that teaches design. So, and I think as a professional, I like to work in that space of, I know I work in the user research space, but I like to work in the space of inclusion and design. As a design professor, I teach pluriversal design. I have a little bit of background as a researcher on collaboration and sharing and the commons and how that leads to more pluriversal forms of UX. And I know as a day job, I work I work for Google for Google Cloud, but I want to make sure I say that anything I share today are my ideas and nothing intersects with the work that I do on a day-to-day.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to preface that as well. I think, these are kind of independent thoughts and ideas. So thanks for saying that. Awesome. So I want to just like jump right into the first thing, which is all around like designing beyond inclusion. So inclusion is a hot topic. People love to talk about it right now, right? It's this, it's D&I, it's, how do we design for everyone? And that ties into like universal design. It's usually in that conversation. Accessibility is in that conversation. But from my perspective, I've noticed that designers and researchers don't have really the language to talk about inclusion outside of accessibility. And it's outside of those things that are a bit more apparent and that are very relevant, obviously. So I wanted to just start that conversation. Like, what are your thoughts around how we design for inclusion and potentially beyond? And what does that even mean to design like beyond inclusion?
One of the things that I think designers and researchers fail to realize is that when they talk about inclusion, they are thinking in terms of there is a center and there are others that we're trying to bring into the center. So they want to be collaborative and they say, well, we're designing for participation and collaboration and understanding and respect, and we're bringing a bunch of people into the center. But what we fail to realize when we do that is that it actually removes the politics from the process of inclusion in a way that is actually presupposes where the center is. And so there's this way in which we have to start thinking about inclusion as acknowledging all the multiple centers and actually creating a sense of belongingness based on what people add. So culture add, value add, as opposed to trying to uniform or shooting for uniformity, as opposed to culture add. So I think that's what we're missing in the conversation around inclusion. And I think that's why, and I know we're going to talk some more about it in a little bit, but that's why the ideas around the pluriverse really are striking to me and quite interesting to me.
That's so interesting. And like, I think one thing that you brought up is like inclusion right now is almost bringing people to back to the place where, they were excluded in the beginning.
Yes.
In the first place. And I think I really love that because I don't think that people really realize that is that's kind of what we're doing. We're saying, okay, everyone belongs in the conversation. Everyone should be added to the product or every user should be valued here. But then it comes down to, to what standard and who is kind of setting the standards of what that value is. And a lot of times we're actually going back to those places that are dominant, those spaces that excluded these users and people and humans in
Yes.
the first place. And I
Yes.
think that's so important to call
Yes.
out.
Yes, you raise a very excellent point. I think, okay, so we always talk about hybridizing. We want to make everybody quite the same. So that's why we tend to include others. We say, well, this is a way of living, this is a way of being. So we're just going to make everyone quite, blended where it's like we're almost the same. And it's very, and I'm going to use a word that most people are not familiar with, like a dualist ontology. So in other words, there's a dichotomy with the way we see living and being. So people think about outside, inside, self, other, subject,
Black or
object,
white.
black, white, but there's a third way of thinking about this when we think in terms of a spectrum. And when you start thinking in terms of a spectrum, you start to acknowledge that there are different ways of being that are more beyond those opposite ends. So we're in a very political political climate right now, and we're thinking Republican and Democrat. But then there's so many people that are blended on the middle, and I think that's what part is really missing from that conversation around inclusion. The posture with which we approach, what we are privileged with and what others are not privileged with, and also the culture with which we approach the value that others bring into the conversation.
I really love that. And I think to me that rings a bell on like positionality. So being able to have position, and to be reflective as designers and researchers in the industry, or just generally in the way that we work and create experiences and products. It's like, how do we, reflect on our own biases, reflect on the fact that as a researcher, as I'm coming into a study, I have my own position, I have my own privileges, even as a Black woman, that I'm bringing into the conversation and I'm bringing into that research. I think that's really great. And actually that's a great transition into the next thing, which is around transitional design and pluriverse. I love to hear your perspective on like what the pluriverse is, what that means, and how that ties into this notion of like thinking towards the spectrum versus duality, right?
That's great. That's awesome. So when I talk about the defining the pluriverse, I like borrowing from Arturo Escobar, the Colombian American sociologist. He wrote the book we talk about quite a bit, you and I, called Designs for the Pluriverse. And in that book, he adapted a definition of the pluriverse from the South American Zapatistas, where it's defined as a world where many worlds fit. And I feel that's a really wonderful definition that actually encapsulates what that means. Where the acknowledgement of different modes of being and living. So in other words, historically, our worlds have been rooted in colonial ontologies, and also in essentially, to a certain extent, using that dangerous term, white supremacy culture, where there's a certain way that we've assumed that we all have to live. And that coloniality of power is very much tied to the Western world. So pluriversality is saying, well, there's more different modes of existing beyond what we've grown to embrace. And that's the story and the definition behind the pluriverse is like, okay, well, how, just thinking about, so many different writers like Chinua Achebe, for example, and others that have said that, I have this right to exist, and you have to acknowledge the right that I have to exist, and you have to come into my world. Like Toni Morrison says, this is my world, you come into my world, and not the other way around. I am a Black female writer, and you have to understand life from my perspective, not from your perspective. So that's I think that's my, at least my way of thinking about the pluriverse.
Yeah, that's so powerful. The Arturo book it's such a long, dense book. But as I skimmed through it, and I definitely picked up on some of those themes. And I think that this definition and like this idea of the pluriverse is just it's a great foundation to start having the conversation. And so, thank you so much for bringing that up. So I feel like one thing that I always struggle with in my work today is how to thinking of how to bring some of these ideas
Yeah,
and into practice.
yeah.
And sometimes I struggle, and the question becomes, is it, maybe practice and industry is not the space for some
Mm,
of these
mm,
ideas.
mm.
But at the same time, there's such a huge impact that we have as we're literally the ones in tech creating experiences and
Yeah,
creating
yeah.
the future of tomorrow. And so I think it's important. But how does designing for the pluriverse and designing, and acknowledging that there are various views, various, positions, various cultures, how does that look like in practice to you? Like, do you have
Yeah.
an idea of that?
Yeah, so yes, I do. I think well, for one thing, I've been kind of messing around with a bunch of principles because designers like
Mm,
to think in terms of
yeah,
principles.
principles, right?
So I've been kind of messing around with a bunch of principles that essentially govern pluriversal design, and I've been investigating those with a lots of people. But even beyond those, even without going into those principles that I've been messing around with, I think it really has a lot to do with posture and worldview.
Mhm.
Like I said, we all designers think very much in terms of hierarchy. We talk about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We talk about systems and designing systems. We talk about 10x scaling. We talk about making sure, we continue to build based on a hierarchy. But, this pluriversal way of thinking actually essentially challenges a little bit of that. And especially when we're thinking about things that relate to social justice and radical equality, acknowledging that all beings have a right to exist, we're actually thinking about dismantling hierarchy. And so, as you're approaching the work that you do as a designer, you have to actually start to think about what are the structures that have been put into the way I approach my work that actually prevent me from expanding my view on design and expanding my approach to my work. A good example, if you're working as a researcher, who do you recruit for your studies? How do you essentially ensure that you have a multiplicity of views and angles to a problem you're trying to solve or trying to understand? If you're a designer, you start to think about what are the unconscious, like you were talking about earlier, what are the unconscious biases that I actually put into the work that I do? We think
Yeah.
about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the AI models that are being built by certain types of people. As a result, the prejudices and the oppression happens even in the technology that we build. So we have to be thinking about these things as we approach the work. So it's a very active mode of engaging with our world that most designers tend to want to avoid, because design is essentially trickle down. But like you were saying much earlier, Hope, you essentially are designing for one and extending to many. And so it's a different way of approaching the work that you do that we normally are not comfortable with.
I completely agree. And that, I mean, that brings me to the next topic of like what role should be played. But this whole idea of like, I love the whole notion of design for everyone is essentially design for no one.
Yeah.
Because, as you think of everyone and designing for everyone as that goal, because
Mhm.
of, things like scale, which are important in the industry, right? You start to lose that richness, you start to lose that goodness of really sitting and like observing and understanding cultures and the nuances of one type of culture, even the intersectionality between like race, gender, sexuality, all of those things. You start to lose that richness when you start to extend for, or you're focused on every one at in the beginning rather than one at a time. And that's what I really love about that approach.
And if I could add to that, scale is important to a certain extent, but
Yeah,
scale not mapped with scope, I think it's a little bit it's
that's
a little
good.
bit limiting. So it's not everything you measure. So we think
Mhm.
about growing and growth and scale, but I always share with people that cancer itself is a growth. So not all growth is good. So you have to think about
Yeah.
things that you can map, and you can actually say, understand, well, how are we mapping to our broader goals of ensuring equity and equality and diversity in systems and those kinds of things. And those are not always measured. Those can be mapped. So yeah, I think scaling up should not be the uber goal. It should not be the core goal, but it could be a goal. There's certain ways. For example, we create products that need to be scaled up, that need to hit critical mass for people to be able to use them. But as we're thinking about those products, we have to think about the edge cases, and measurements is not the way to understand edge cases. You almost have to map to those.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's what I love about speculative design. This whole idea of, and I would love to see a balance of speculative approaches to the type of approaches, exploratory approaches that we do in research. But I think that it's important to sometimes not have to solution, or sometimes not have to measure things, right? Because then that allows that space for us to really reimagine what the futures that we want, right? And I think that blend, I almost feel like in the industry, we really do need a good balance of being able to take things and run with them and reimagine new spaces, while also balancing the today, the present, the measurement, the scale factor, the actual growth of the product that we're working on, or experiences that we're working on as well. So that's awesome. That's important as well.
Yeah, and design superpowers are being able to reframe problems, right?
Yeah,
asking questions, how might we, and what if, and I think what you're saying, designers are by nature speculative, and I think we don't want to lose that in design.
Agreed. So one more thing, and I think we're probably at about time here. There's this concept that I recently heard of. It's an approach that I think is borrowed from community-based design. It's called assets-based design. And it's this notion that users are not, we shouldn't necessarily always look at users as being plagued with problems. Because it's really reframing problems as superpowers, and I call it superpowers. So reframing problems as values and strengths and knowledge that a community has, rather than designing for their problems. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think on one hand, I actually attended a conference, the CSCW conference, a few weeks ago, and talked about this in a workshop. But on one hand, I see a lot of value in that approach, because it's definitely moving away from this needs-based approach, allowing for a bit more speculation / really taking into account the strengths of communities and different types of communities, rather than just the problems that they have. Because who's to say we're the ones to fix their problems, right? And that's a whole other conversation. But what are your thoughts on that? Because I think on one hand, I see a lot of positives in that approach, like I said, but I think on the other hand, I'm a bit iffy on whether or not we call superpowers assets.
Yeah,
and we kind of tie and whether or not we should be looking at it in sort of that economical kind of way. I don't know. And maybe it's just a matter of language, though, at the same time. So yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a really excellent point. One of the challenges I have with even the term user experience is the fetishization of the user as problem laden, and that almost they understand the solutions that they need to solve their problems. And I feel like one of the things that it fails to account for is that we all live and exist in an ecosystem that is not only engaging with, there's not only users, we live in and with the artificial. We've created an artificial, and we live and exist with non-humans that essentially constitute our world. And I think when we kind of orient design towards the quote user, I think it actually tends to be a little bit problematic. So I like the idea of thinking beyond the user. Now, thinking in terms of assets might be a little bit constraining, like you said. You're thinking in terms of assets, you're thinking economically,
Exactly.
um, and you're thinking in terms of value added and value given and value taken, and it's a little bit worrisome to think in that narrow scope. But it's a good beginning for, or a good starting point for that conversation of, okay, what's UX research? What's UX design beyond the user? Because really we're understanding experiences. We're not creating experiences. We're understanding how people are experiencing things, using the word of Lucy Suchman, I believe. We're like, actually Liz Sanders, we're understanding how people are experiencing things. We're not creating experiences for them. And so when we think in terms of that, then we actually say, well, the human is important, but the human is not alone. The human is participating, not only with other humans, but they're also participating with their environment. And I think thinking beyond that assets-based design, sorry, the user-centered design approach, and thinking, in other things like assets and stuff like that, is a very good starting point. Obviously, we haven't found the right word, but it's a great starting point.
I agree. But yeah, no, this was so great and insightful. And this is going to be really awesome just to continue the conversation.